Where did the coronavirus come from? There is a new investigation into its origins. U.S. intelligence officials tell NBC News that they are examining whether the virus accidentally came from a Chinese lab. Defense Secretary Esper weighed in, accusing China of misleading the public.
This is something we've been watching closely now for some time. The results are inconclusive, if you will.
On this particular point, do you think the Chinese have misled about the origins of the virus?
Well, like I said, I can't speak to intelligence matters, but I find it hard to trust much of what comes out of the Chinese Communist Party.
NBC News correspondent Ken Dilanian joins me now. And Ken, what information do intelligence officials have so far on that lab?
Well, Allison, they don't have a smoking gun case, we are told, but there is circumstantial evidence that's leading them to believe that it's possible that this virus escaped accidentally from a lab in Wuhan that was studying coronaviruses in bats. And separately, experts are saying that the theory that it began at that wet market in Wuhan is fading because many of the early cases had no connection to the wet market. So U.S. intelligence officials are telling us, look, it's possible it came from this lab. It's possible it didn't. We don't have a conclusive evidence either way, but we're not ruling it out, which is interesting because at the beginning of all this, there were some people who were touting the conspiracy theory that it was made in a lab as a bioweapon. That they have ruled out, Allison. It's not a bioweapon. It's a naturally occurring virus in bats that they were studying at this lab in Wuhan, which was also looking at the virus that caused the SARS pandemic back in 2015.
Ken, are we getting any sort of response yet from China on this investigation?
Yeah, the Chinese government today denied that this possibly could have come from the lab, as you might expect. But look, U.S. officials have been saying they haven't been able to trust anything from the Chinese government from the beginning. It's very clear now that China was not upfront with the world about when they learned about this virus and the outbreak. They were suppressing voices that were trying to warn about it. And interestingly, the Washington Post has reported on some cables that where officials from the State Department 2 years ago visited this lab and raised concerns about safety there. Said, hey, they're doing important work on coronaviruses, but we're not sure that they're meeting all of the safety standards. So the theory would be that somebody accidentally got infected in this lab and then walked out and infected other people in Wuhan, and it spread from there. It's something out of a Hollywood movie, Allison, but it's something that U.S. intelligence officials are not ruling out.
Ken, I feel like we keep saying this over and over again. Life is starting to feel just a little bit too much like a movie these days. Let me ask you how this impacts the original thought on where the virus came from. Health experts have suspected that it came from an animal market in Wuhan. Has that been ruled out, or has that theory changed yet, or is that still one of the possibilities?
That's still one of the possibilities, and it's being debated. But there are a growing number of experts who are raising questions about that theory because they are saying a number of early cases, this has been traced back to some of the earliest cases, had no connection to that market. They weren't related weren't related to anybody who was there, no contact with anybody who was there. So it's a growing question. Some people I talk to are discounting the wet market explanation. Other experts are still saying that's the most likely one. We may never get the full answer to this, but U.S. intelligence officials are gathering evidence. They're spying. They're listening to communications, they're talking to human sources on the ground, and they're likely going to get more information in the coming weeks and months, Allison.
Ken, we're also hearing that congressional Republicans are planning to investigate the coronavirus outbreak, focusing on China and the World Health Organization. What are they looking for?
Well, yes, congressional Republicans, particularly in the Senate, do want to have, they want to gather information about whether China was up front with the world and the United States about the origins of the virus, whether they misrepresented. There's also separately, Allison, investigations by the Democrats on the House and Senate Intelligence Committee who are gathering all the intelligence warnings that were sent to the White House and other places in the early months of this, December, January, before the Trump administration really began acting, to see what warnings the U.S. Intelligence Committee issued about the potential for a pandemic. So lots of congressional oversight. There's plans for a big sort of 9/11 style commission to look at what happened here. This is something that we'll be living with for years, Allison.
Yeah, we've got investigations aplenty. Ken Dilanian, thanks so much for updating us there. Appreciate it, and I hope you're doing well.
Thanks a lot. You too. Thanks.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here. And click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.